The Case of the Silent Bell. It was upon a raw and gusty morning in the late autumn of 1898 that Sherlock Holmes received a communication which roused him from the lethargy that had oppressed him for several days. I had observed with some concern the signs of restlessness in my friend, the fits of abstraction, the aimless pacing of our rooms at Baker Street, the violin dragged forth only to be played in fits and starts. When the boy in buttons brought up the telegram upon a salver, Holmes seized it with an eagerness that told me the drought was at an end. He read it once, twice, then tossed it across the breakfast table to me with a gleam in his grey eyes. "Read it aloud, Watson," said he. I took up the flimsy yellow sheet and read, "St. Aldhelm's Church, Belminster. Bell failed to ring last night for first time in 3 centuries. Fearful consequences. Beg immediate assistance. Respectfully, Elias Hawthorne." "Curious," remarked Holmes, leaning back in his chair and forming a steeple with his long, thin fingers. "A bell that has rung without fail since the reign of Queen Elizabeth suddenly falls silent. Superstition, no doubt, but superstition often masks very material facts. What do you make of it, Watson?" I confessed that I could make little of it beyond the evident anxiety of the sender. "Then pack your bag," said Holmes, rising with decision. "We leave on the 11:15 from Paddington. A problem at last, and one that promises to be out of the common." The journey to Belminster took us through a landscape already touched by winter. The fields lay bare and brown beneath a lowering sky, and a cold wind drove ragged clouds across the face of the pale sun. As we changed trains at a desolate junction and boarded the little branch-line train that served the western counties, the weather worsened. Rain began to lash the carriage windows, and by the time we descended at Belminster station, the afternoon had turned to a premature twilight. The village itself lay in a narrow valley, cupped between 2 ranges of low hills. Even in the gloom I could make out the square Norman tower of the church rising above the clustered roofs, and from the moment our train halted, I became aware of an unusual stir among the inhabitants. A knot of villagers had gathered upon the platform, and as Holmes and I stepped down, they pressed forward with murmurs and anxious glances. A tall, stooping gentleman in clerical dress detached himself from the group and came towards us, hat in hand. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired in a voice that trembled with age and agitation. "At your service, Reverend Hawthorne," replied my friend. The vicar was a man of 70 or more, with a thin, ascetic face framed by white hair. His eyes were bright with fear. "Thank heaven you have come," he said. "The whole village is in a state of nervous terror. For 300 years the great bell of St. Aldhelm's has rung every evening at 9 o'clock, and last night it was silent. The people believe the old curse has fallen upon us at last." Holmes's lips twitched in a faint smile. "We shall see about the curse," said he. "First, pray conduct us to the church." As we walked through the village street, I observed how the inhabitants watched us from doorways and windows. There was no mistaking the atmosphere of unease that hung over Belminster like the mist that now began to drift down from the hills. The rain had ceased, but the air was raw and damp, and the cobbled street glistened under the yellow light of the few gas lamps that had been lit early. At the end of the street stood the church itself, ancient and grey, with its massive tower brooding over the churchyard. Reverend Hawthorne led us through the lich gate and up the flagged path, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. "You shall stay at the vicarage," he said. "It is but a step across the yard. My housekeeper will have tea ready, and tonight at 9 o'clock, you shall hear for yourselves whether the bell rings or no." Holmes glanced up at the dark bulk of the tower against the darkening sky. "I shall do more than hear, Reverend," said he quietly. "I intend to discover why a bell that has rung faithfully for 3 centuries should choose this particular moment to fall silent. And with those words ringing in my ears, we passed beneath the porch and into the silent church. Over a simple but welcome tea in the vicarage parlour, Reverend Hawthorne recounted to us the history of the bell and the strange superstition that clung to it. The room was low-ceilinged and warm, with a fire crackling in the grate, yet the vicar's tale carried a chill that no flames could dispel. The great bell of St. Aldhelm's, he began, was cast in the year 1598, during the reign of good Queen Bess. It was the gift of Sir Reginald Bellamy, the founder of the chief family in these parts. The Bellamys had grown rich upon the wool trade, but Sir Reginald lay under a dying curse pronounced by a wandering friar whom he had unjustly accused of theft and caused to be hanged. The friar's last words were that misfortune should dog the Bellamy line until the bell he had blessed should cease to sound its nightly note of warning. Holmes, who had been listening with half-closed eyes, here interposed a question. "And what form, precisely, is this misfortune supposed to take?" "That every male heir of the direct line," replied the vicar solemnly, "shall meet a violent end should the bell ever fail to ring upon a single evening. For 3 centuries the warning has been heeded. Rain or shine, war or peace, the bell has been rung faithfully at 9 o'clock by the vicar or his deputy. And in all that time, no Bellamy heir has died peacefully in his bed, yet the bell has never once been silent until last night." I could not suppress a slight shiver, though I am no believer in curses. Holmes, however, merely nodded. "Continue, if you please," said he. "The last direct male heir," went on Hawthorne, "is young Geoffrey Bellamy, a distant cousin of the original line, who came into the estate some 5 years ago upon the death of his uncle. Drowned, poor man, while fishing alone upon the mere. Geoffrey is but 25 and much liked in the village, though some say he is wild. The estate is heavily encumbered, and there has been talk of selling part of the glebe land that borders the churchyard, an arrangement that would require my consent as vicar." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ah, a material consideration beneath the supernatural veil. And last night?" "Last night I myself went to the vestry at 8:45, as is my custom. The rope hangs there, passing up through the floor to the belfry above. I pulled it steadily for the full minute, yet no sound came from the tower. I pulled again, still silence. I summoned the sexton, old Tom Graves, who climbed the stair to the belfry. He reported that the bell appeared normal, the clapper in place, the rope securely fastened. Yet it would not sound." "And no one had been seen near the church?" asked Holmes. "No one. The vestry door was locked, the key upon my own ring. The only other entrance is the belfry door at the top of the spiral stair, which is always bolted from within when the tower is unoccupied." Holmes rose abruptly. "I should like to examine the mechanism before nightfall." The vicar led us across the churchyard to the tower door. The interior was dim and smelled of ancient stone and candle smoke. A narrow spiral stair wound upward. The vestry below was a small chamber containing only a table, a chair, and the long bell rope hanging through a hole in the ceiling. Holmes examined the rope minutely, then climbed swiftly to the belfry. The great bell hung in its wooden frame, a massive bronze casting green with age. Holmes inspected the clapper, the wheel, the stays. Everything appeared in order. He pulled the rope himself. The bell swung and gave forth a deep, mournful note that echoed across the valley. "Perfectly sound," he remarked as we descended. "Yet last night it refused its office. Most intriguing." That evening, after a plain supper at the vicarage, Holmes and I took up positions in the churchyard shortly before 9 o'clock. The mist had thickened and the air was raw. A few villagers lingered at the lich gate, watching nervously. The church clock began to chime the hour. 8 slow strokes, then the quarter, then 9. Holmes stood motionless beside me, his eyes fixed upon the dark bulk of the tower. The last stroke died away. Silence. No answering note rolled out across the sleeping village. The great bell of St. Aldhelm's remained mute. A low murmur arose from the watchers at the gate. Somewhere a woman began to sob. Holmes turned to me, his face pale and eager in the lamplight. "Come, Watson," said he in a low voice. "The game has truly begun. Tomorrow we shall discover whether this is indeed a curse, or something considerably more human." The following morning broke dull and cheerless, with a thin drizzle drifting across the valley. I awoke early, disturbed by uneasy dreams in which a great bronze bell swung silently in the darkness. Holmes, as was his habit when a problem engrossed him, had risen before me. When I descended to the vicarage breakfast room, I found him already at the table, his plate untouched, studying a rough plan of the church tower he had sketched the previous evening. "Any fresh thoughts, Holmes?" I inquired as I poured coffee. "Several, Watson," he replied, "but none yet conclusive. The bell rang when I pulled it yesterday, yet refused its office at 9 o'clock. The rope passes directly from the vestry to the belfry without obstruction. Someone, or something, must have prevented the clapper from striking the bell at the critical moment. We shall examine the mechanism again after breakfast. We had scarcely finished our meal when a violent knocking sounded at the vicarage door. Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, a gaunt, sharp-featured woman of 50, entered the room, pale and trembling. "Mr. Holmes, sir, the Reverend. He's not in his room, and the church door was unbolted. Tom Graves has gone to look." Holmes was on his feet in an instant. "Come, Watson." We hurried across the wet churchyard, followed by the agitated housekeeper. The south door of the church stood ajar. Inside, the sexton, old Tom Graves, was calling from the foot of the tower stair. "Up here, sir, quick." We mounted the spiral steps, 2 at a time. The belfry door at the top stood open. Graves stood just within, his face ashen. Reverend Hawthorne lay upon the stone floor near the bell rope, his limbs composed as though in sleep, but his face wore an expression of mild surprise. He was quite dead. Holmes knelt beside the body with that eager yet detached air I had seen so often at scenes of tragedy. The vicar was fully dressed in his clerical garments, as though he had come to the belfry during the night. There was no mark of violence upon him, no blood, no sign of a struggle. The belfry door was fitted with a heavy iron bolt on the inside, and this was shot home. The 2 narrow lancet windows were scarcely wide enough to admit a child. The bell rope hung motionless, exactly as we had left it. "Locked in," murmured Holmes, testing the bolt. The door was bolted from within, the windows impossible. Yet the man is dead. He examined the floor minutely with his lens, then the rope, the bell itself, the dead man's hands and face. At length he rose. "Rigor mortis is well established. He has been dead at least 8 hours. Time of death between midnight and 3 a.m., I should say. No external injury. We must await the police surgeon for the internal examination." Graves, who had been hovering at the door, now spoke in a shaken voice. "I came to ring the morning Angelus at 6, sir. Found the church door open, which it never is, and the Reverend gone from his bed. Came up here and found this." Holmes turned to him sharply. "You have a key to the church?" "Aye, sir, and so has the Reverend. But the belfry door is always left unbolted at night. The rope is pulled from the vestry below, you see." By midday, Inspector Lestrade had arrived from London, summoned by Holmes's own telegram. The little detective bustled into the churchyard with his rat-like face full of professional importance. "Another of your impossible crimes, Mr. Holmes," he said with a sneer. "Locked room, eh? Well, we'll soon get to the bottom of it. Probably heart failure brought on by all this nonsense about curses, country superstitions." Holmes smiled faintly. "Perhaps." Yet I have observed several points which may interest you. The faint scratches upon the belfry floor near the door, recent, I fancy. The trace of oil upon the bell wheel, the curious pallor of the lips, and the slight cherry-red discoloration of the skin. And this. He held out a small object he had taken from the dead man's waistcoat pocket, a single staple. Lestrade stared at it stupidly. A staple? What of it? That, said Holmes quietly, is for us to discover. But I think we may dismiss both heart failure and the curse, for the moment. As we left the church, the mist was lifting a little, but the village remained wrapped in gloom. The news had spread, and groups of villagers stood whispering at street corners. I confess I felt the weight of the mystery pressing upon me. A man dead in a locked tower, a bell silent after 3 centuries, an ancient curse apparently fulfilled. Holmes, however, walked with that springy step which told me he was in his element. "The game is afoot, Watson," said he, "and this time it promises to be a 3-pipe problem at least." With the churchyard now thronged by villagers and the local constable keeping a wary guard over the tower, Holmes suggested that we repair to the village inn for our inquiries. The Belminster Arms was an ancient half-timbered building opposite the church, its low-beamed parlour already filling with anxious parishioners seeking warmth and rumour. Holmes secured a private room at the back, and one by one we summoned those most nearly concerned in the tragedy. First came young Geoffrey Bellamy, the last heir of the cursed line. He was a tall, handsome fellow of 25, with fair hair and a reckless eye. His manner was defiant, yet I detected an underlying unease. "I was at home all night," he declared in answer to Holmes's questions. "My man can vouch for me until midnight, and after that I was alone in the library. I heard nothing until the sexton's cries this morning." Holmes regarded him steadily. "You are aware, Mr. Bellamy, that the failure of the bell and the vicar's death appear to fulfill the terms of the ancient curse upon your family?" Bellamy laughed, but it rang hollow. "I am aware the village gossips will say so. The estate is mortgaged to the hilt. Everyone knows that. If the glebe land could be sold, my debts would be cleared. But murder the vicar to bring that about? Absurd. Besides, the old gentleman had promised to consider the sale in due course." Next entered Miss Clara Thorne, Reverend Hawthorne's ward and the church organist. She was a slight, dark-haired girl of 20, pale and composed, though her fingers trembled as she clasped them in her lap. "I retired early," she said softly. "The vicar was distressed by the bell's silence and spoke of watching in the church himself. I begged him not to, but he was stubborn." I heard no sound during the night. Holmes leaned forward. "You are engaged to Mr. Geoffrey Bellamy, I believe?" A faint flush coloured her cheeks. "We have an understanding, sir, though the vicar did not approve. He feared the Bellamy blood was tainted by the old stories." Old Tom Graves, the sexton, came third. He was a bent, weather-beaten man of 70 with hands gnarled from half a century of labour. "I've rung that bell when the vicar was ill," he croaked. "Pulled it from the vestry many a time. Last night I was in my cottage by 10. My daughter will swear to it. This morning I found him, God rest his soul." Holmes asked him minutely about the tower mechanism, the keys, the bolting of doors. Graves answered readily, but I noticed he avoided looking directly at the young heir. Last came Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper. She was dry-eyed and tight-lipped, her disapproval of the proceedings evident. The Reverend was a good man, she stated. Too good for some I could name. He went to the church about 11 o'clock. I heard him leave the house, said he would pray in the chancel until midnight. After that, nothing until morning. And you heard no cry, no sound from the tower? Not a whisper, though I did dream of footsteps on the stairs, ghostly footsteps. Holmes dismissed her with a nod, then sat in silence for some minutes, his fingertips pressed together. "The field narrows, Watson," he said at last. "We have motive in young Bellamy, the clearing of his debts through the sale of church land made possible by the vicar's death. Opportunity is more difficult but not impossible. Miss Thorne has affection for Bellamy and resentment toward her guardian. The sexton has intimate knowledge of the tower. The housekeeper, well, we shall see," I ventured a remark. "But the locked belfry, Holmes, the bolted door from within." "Exactly," said he with satisfaction. "A locked room is merely a room whose method of locking and unlocking has not yet been discovered, and the curse, convenient cover for a very human crime." The bell was silenced deliberately, the vicar lured or driven to the belfry, and they're dispatched by some means that leaves no external mark. Tomorrow we shall examine the church records and the Bellamy papers. Tonight I propose we keep watch ourselves. As we left the inn, the short winter day was already drawing to a close. The mist had returned, thicker than before, wrapping the village in a grey shroud. Somewhere in the tower the great bell hung silent, and I confess that for the first time in many an adventure with Sherlock Holmes, I felt the chill fingers of superstition brush against my rational soul. Holmes, however, strode ahead, his eyes alight with that fierce joy he knew only when the game was at its hottest. "Come, Watson," he cried. "We have work before us, and the curse of the Bellamys is not yet fulfilled." The day following the discovery of the vicar's body was one of ceaseless activity for Sherlock Holmes. While Lestrade busied himself with the formalities, summoning the police surgeon from the county town and taking statements from half the village, Holmes pursued his own silent and methodical inquiry. We began at dawn in the church tower itself. The body had been removed to the vicarage for examination, but the belfry remained sealed by the constable. Holmes dismissed the man with a word and spent a full hour upon his hands and knees, examining every inch of the stone floor with his powerful lens. "Observe, Watson," said he at length, pointing to a series of faint scratches near the door, "parallel marks, as though made by a metal edge drawn across the stone, and here traces of fresh oil upon the pivot of the bell wheel. Someone has been at work here recently." He then turned his attention to the bell rope, measuring its length, testing its tension, and noting the precise point where it passed through the hole in the vestry ceiling below. From his pocket he produced a small vial and carefully scraped a few grains of pale residue from the dead man's fingertips into it. "Curious," he murmured. "A crystalline substance, odorless. We shall analyze this later." Descending to the vestry, Holmes lay full length upon the floor and examined the hole through which the rope passed. With a tape measure he calculated the distance from floor to belfry, then climbed once more to confirm his figures. "The rope is exactly the length required," he said. "No more, no less. Yet last night it failed to move the clapper. Someone must have interfered with the mechanism at the critical moment." Throughout the morning he questioned minor witnesses, the verger, the choir boys, even the gardener who tended the churchyard. From each he extracted small details. The vicar had seemed preoccupied the previous day, had spoken of feeling watched, had handled his ancient prayer book more than usual during evening service. By noon we repaired to the vicarage, where the police surgeon, a stout red-faced man named Dr. Ames, had completed his examination. "Poison," he announced bluntly to Lestrade and Holmes. "No doubt of it. The cherry-red coloration of the blood, the absence of other trauma, classic signs of carbon monoxide poisoning. Yet how it was administered in a locked tower baffles me. There was no brazier, no charcoal burner, nothing." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Carbon monoxide, you say? Interesting. And the stomach contents?" "Tea and a light supper, nothing unusual. Traces of a bitter alkaloid, perhaps. But the primary cause is the gas." Lestrade looked triumphant. Suicide, then. The old gentleman, frightened by the curse, barricaded himself in and somehow contrived to poison himself with furnace gas. Holmes shook his head. The belfry has no flue, no possible source of such gas. And suicide by bolting the door from within and then poisoning oneself. Possible, but unlikely in a man of the vicar's character. No, we must look for a more ingenious explanation. In the afternoon, Holmes turned his attention to the church records. In the dusty muniment room, he pored over ancient parchments and ledgers, tracing the history of the Bellamy gift and the glebe land. I watched as his long fingers turned the yellowed pages, pausing now and then to make notes in his pocketbook. At length he leaned back with a chuckle. "The motive strengthens, Watson. A forgotten clause in Sir Reginald Bellamy's original bequest. Should the bell cease to ring during the incumbency of a Hawthorne vicar, the glebe land reverts absolutely to the Bellamy heir. The present Reverend Hawthorne was the last of his line, no successor named. Young Geoffrey would gain clear title worth thousands. But murder, Holmes? Precisely. And murder disguised as the fulfillment of a curse." As evening drew on, Holmes tested the acoustics of the tower. He had me stand in the churchyard while he spoke from the belfry in a normal voice, every word carried clearly down. Then he dropped small objects upon the stone floor. The sound echoed loudly through the building. No struggle could have occurred up there without being heard in the village, he concluded. Yet no one heard a thing. The vicar was either rendered unconscious before being carried up, or he went willingly. I confess the mystery seemed to deepen with every hour. The silent bell, the locked room, the poison without source, all pointed to a criminal of extraordinary cunning. Holmes, however, appeared almost gay as we walked back to the vicarage through the gathering dusk. "Patience, Watson," said he, clapping me on the shoulder. "We have the threads in our hands. Tonight we shall set a trap that will draw our spider from his web." As dusk fell upon the second day, Sherlock Holmes's plans took definite shape. He had spent the afternoon in quiet conference with the sexton and a local blacksmith, issuing instructions that puzzled me at the time. When I pressed him for an explanation, he merely smiled and said, "Tonight we shall give the bell every opportunity to ring, and our murderer every opportunity to betray himself." At 8 o'clock we gathered in the vestry, Holmes, myself, Lestrade, who had been persuaded to join us with some difficulty, young Bellamy, Miss Thorne, Graves the sexton, and Mrs. Pritchard. Holmes had insisted upon their presence, saying that the village must see the matter settled once and for all. "The bell shall be rung this evening as usual," he announced. "Tom Graves will pull the rope from this room at 9 o'clock precisely. We shall all remain here together until the hour has passed. If the bell sounds, the curse is broken. If it remains silent, we shall know that human agency, and not supernatural, has been at work." Lestrade grumbled that it was all stuff and nonsense, but Holmes's calm assurance silenced him. We waited in the dim vestry, the only light coming from a single lamp upon the table. The rope hung motionless in the centre of the room. Conversation was fitful. Bellamy paced restlessly. Miss Thorne sat pale and still. Mrs. Pritchard stared fixedly at the floor. Graves stood ready by the rope. The church clock began to strike 9. Graves grasped the rope and pulled with the steady rhythm of long practice. The rope rose and fell, yet no sound came from the tower above. A low exclamation escaped Bellamy. Miss Thorne covered her face with her hands. Lestrade muttered something about trickery. Holmes waited until the last stroke had died away, then rose swiftly. "Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The experiment is complete. The bell remains silent under controlled conditions. There is no curse, only a very clever mechanical interference. Dr. Watson and I will now repair to the belfry. Inspector Lestrade, pray remain here with the others." Followed by the bewildered policeman's protests, we mounted the tower stairs. In the belfry, Holmes lit his bull's-eye lantern and played its beam across the mechanism. With a low cry of satisfaction, he pointed to a thin wire that now ran from the bell's clapper to a small counterweight hidden behind the wooden frame. "See, Watson. The wire tightens when the rope is pulled, holding the clapper away from the bell. A simple yet ingenious device, installed recently, I fancy, and removed after the crime to conceal the method." He traced the wire to a tiny pulley, then to a concealed staple in the floor near the door. "But the door was bolted from within," I objected. "Exactly. Our murderer entered the belfry with the vicar, perhaps under pretense of examining the bell, poisoned him with the carbon monoxide generated from a small spirit lamp and chemicals concealed in a false-bottomed prayer book, the residue we found upon his hands. The vicar, feeling the effects, was left alone. The murderer then passed a thread through the staple, drew the bolt home and withdrew, pulling the thread after him. A touch of wax sealed the tiny hole. The wire was later removed during the confusion of discovery. I was lost in admiration of his insight. But the motive, Holmes. We had descended to the churchyard where the mist now lay thick and cold. Holmes paused beneath a gas lamp and lit his pipe, the match flaring briefly upon his eager face. "The motive, my dear Watson, lies in that forgotten clause I discovered this afternoon. Should the great bell cease to ring during the tenure of a Hawthorne vicar, the glebe land, 20 acres of prime meadow, reverts absolutely to the Bellamy heir, free of all encumbrance. Young Geoffrey's debts would be paid, his estate saved. But the clause requires that the bell shall not ring again while a Hawthorne lives. The vicar's death was necessary to complete the transfer before a new incumbent could be appointed. Geoffrey Bellamy, then? Perhaps. Or someone acting for him. Miss Thorne, for love. Even the housekeeper, she is, I suspect, a distant Bellamy relation. But the beauty of the plan was that the curse itself would direct suspicion away from any human agency. Tomorrow we shall reconstruct the crime in full, and our murderer will betray himself. As we walked back to the vicarage through the silent village, I glanced up at the dark tower. The great bell hung there, mute witness to a crime that blended ancient superstition with the coldest modern calculation. Holmes's step was light, his eyes shining. "A capital problem, Watson," said he, "one that does credit to its author. But every chain has its weakest link, and tomorrow we shall find it." On the third evening after our arrival in Belminster, Sherlock Holmes staged his reconstruction of the crime. The church was lit by flickering oil lamps casting long shadows across the ancient pews. All those concerned had been summoned. Young Geoffrey Bellamy, Miss Clara Thorne, Tom Graves the sexton, Mrs. Pritchard the housekeeper, Inspector Lestrade, and several villagers as witnesses. Reverend Hawthorne's body had been laid to rest that afternoon. The inquest had returned a verdict of wilful murder by person or persons unknown. Holmes stood beneath the chancel arch, his lean figure thrown into sharp relief by the lamplight, his eyes bright with that fierce energy I knew so well. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have here a crime that appears impossible. A bell silenced after 300 years, a vicar poisoned in a tower locked from within, an ancient curse seemingly fulfilled. Yet no curse has been at work, only human cunning of a high order. Tonight I shall demonstrate exactly how the murder was committed." He led us first to the vestry, where the bell rope hung as usual. "On the night of the crime," said Holmes, "the murderer prepared a simple but effective device. A thin wire was attached to the clapper above and led to a small counterweight concealed in the frame. When the rope was pulled, the wire tightened, preventing the clapper from striking the bell. The device was installed days earlier, perhaps under pretense of repair. Lestrade snorted. But the bell rang when you pulled it the next day. Precisely, replied Holmes with a smile, because the murderer removed the wire immediately after the crime, during the confusion of the discovery. We then mounted to the belfry. Holmes had caused the blacksmith to recreate the mechanism from his measurements. He demonstrated how the wire held the clapper immobile, then released it. The bell gave forth its deep note. The vicar, continued Holmes, was lured here by a note, or perhaps by his own anxiety over the bell's silence. He arrived carrying his ancient prayer book. Unbeknown to him, the murderer had prepared the book with a false compartment containing a small spirit lamp and chemicals that, when ignited, would produce carbon monoxide in sufficient quantity to prove fatal in the confined space. He produced the vicar's prayer book, which had been recovered from the vestry, and opened it to reveal a cunning hollow fitted with a tiny burner. The murderer ignited the device, perhaps under cover of showing the vicar some fault in the bell. The vicar, feeling the effects of the poison, drowsiness, confusion, was left alone. The murderer then performed the final act. Holmes took a length of strong thread and a lump of wax from his pocket. The door was bolted from within by passing the thread through a small staple, here where the faint scratches were found. The bolt was drawn home, the thread withdrawn, and the hole sealed with wax. A touch invisible to the casual eye. He demonstrated the trick before our eyes. The heavy bolt slid home as though by ghostly agency. Young Bellamy had gone very pale. Miss Thorne clutched his arm. Mrs. Pritchard stood rigid, her lips compressed. The poison was slow-acting, Holmes went on. The vicar died peacefully, believing perhaps that the curse had claimed him. The murderer descended, removed the wire device the next morning amid the confusion, and trusted that superstition would shield him from suspicion. Lestrade stepped forward. A pretty theory, Mr. Holmes, but who? Holmes raised a hand. One final test. Mrs. Pritchard, you stated that you dreamed of ghostly footsteps upon the stairs, yet no one heard real footsteps. Why? The housekeeper met his gaze steadily. Dreams are dreams, sir. Indeed, but dreams sometimes betray a troubled conscience. You are, I believe, a natural daughter of the Bellamy family, born on the wrong side of the blanket to Sir Reginald's younger brother. You have served the Hawthorns faithfully these 30 years, yet your loyalty was divided. When young Geoffrey's debts threatened the estate, your estate by blood, you saw a way to save it and fulfill the old clause simultaneously. Mrs. Pritchard's face twisted. Lies. But Holmes continued inexorably. You prepared the prayer book. You had access. You silenced the bell. You lured the vicar here with talk of a supernatural manifestation. And when suspicion fell upon young Bellamy, you were content, for the land would still come to the family. With a sudden cry, the woman broke. He was an old fool, blocking the sale that would have saved us all. The curse was meant to be fulfilled. She collapsed, sobbing into the arms of the constable. Lestrade, for once speechless, snapped the handcuffs upon her wrists. Holmes turned away, his face grim. A sad business, Watson. Superstition and greed, a fatal combination. As we left the church, the great bell was rung once more by the sexton, a solemn peal for the dead vicar and for the end of an ancient terror. The arrest of Mrs. Pritchard brought the affair of the silent bell to its melancholy close. Under questioning at the local police station, she made a full confession. For years she had cherished a secret pride in her Bellamy blood, nursing resentment against the Hawthorns who had, in her eyes, usurped the family's rightful prosperity. When young Geoffrey's extravagance threatened ruin to the estate, she saw in the ancient clause a means of salvation and revenge. She had installed the wire mechanism herself, using her knowledge of the tower gained over decades of service. The prayer book had been prepared in secret, the chemicals obtained from a travelling peddler under pretense of rat poison. On the fatal night, she had coaxed the vicar to the belfry with tales of strange noises, ignited the deadly device, and performed the thread and bolt trick with the calm precision of one long accustomed to household management. Young Bellamy and Miss Thorne were exonerated. Their engagement, now unopposed, promised a happier future for the estate. The glebe land remained with the church, and a new vicar was appointed within the month. The great bell rang faithfully each evening thereafter, its deep note rolling across the valley as it had for 3 centuries. Lestrade, though he claimed the credit in his official report, was gracious enough to thank Holmes privately as our train steamed back toward London. "A neat piece of work, Mr. Holmes," he admitted grudgingly, "though how you suspected the housekeeper from the first I'll never know." Holmes smiled faintly, filling his pipe with Arcadia mixture. The dream of ghostly footsteps was the key, Inspector. No real footsteps were heard. Therefore the dream betrayed a knowledge that could only belong to the murderer. The rest followed. Some weeks later, as we sat before the fire in our old rooms at Baker Street, I turned over the notes of the case and ventured a remark. "It was a grim business, Holmes. Superstition and greed combined to destroy a harmless old man." Holmes puffed thoughtfully for a moment, the smoke curling upward in the lamplight. "True, Watson. Yet consider, the curse was real in its way. It endured for 300 years because men believed in it and shaped their actions accordingly. Mrs. Pritchard did not invent the legend. She merely used it as a cloak for murder. Human credulity is the true curse that dogs our race." I could not but agree. "And the bell? Will it ring forever now?" Holmes leaned back, his eyes half closed. "Until some new necessity arises, my dear fellow. Bells, like men, are silent only when there is reason for silence. But let us hope that in Belminster, at least, the reason will henceforth be innocent." Outside, the London fog pressed against our windows, and the distant rumble of traffic rose and fell like the echo of some great unseen bell. Holmes reached for his violin and drew the bow softly across the strings, playing a slow, mournful air that seemed to summon up the misty valley and the ancient tower we had left behind. Thus ended the adventure of the silent bell, one which, though it added no lustre to Sherlock Holmes's reputation in the public eye, remains in my memory as a striking example of how the past may reach forth its hand to strangle the present unless the light of reason be brought to bear upon its shadows.